I stepped outside, the leash in my hand, ready to take my dog for a walk and get in a quick run. As I watched my neighbors starting their cars and heading off to work, I let out a long sigh. It hit me all at once. I no longer had an office or a job to rush off to. After my business went bankrupt, I was left with a mountain of debt, and today would be another day spent at home, trying, yet again, to revive the business that had once been thriving but now seemed doomed to failure. The weight of these setbacks made me feel like I was drifting through life while the world around me just kept moving forward without me. I noticed my neighbor Tom walking over from his neatly kept driveway. Tom ran a successful car import business and often had a collection of luxury cars parked outside his house. Today was no different, and he walked toward me, grinning like he had all the time in the world. He greeted me with more cheer than I was prepared for, almost too much cheer. I forced a smile as his grin only seemed to stretch wider. I joked about him having another day of relaxation, but his response stung. I calmly pointed out that every day brings its own set of challenges. Tom simply laughed, telling me he had cars to import, and then he strolled off. I stood there for a moment, watching him leave, trying not to let his careless words bother me. Some people, I reminded myself, just can't help but gloat. Coming home used to be a place of relief for me, but lately, it felt like walking into a storm. Not because of the house itself, but because of the person who lived inside, my wife, Samantha. Samantha, an insurance agent, had become distant and cold ever since my financial troubles started. The change was almost jarring. The excitement of her calling me home early for a romantic dinner or to cuddle on the couch for a movie night was gone. Conversations that used to be warm and loving had now turned short and impersonal. What used to be a sanctuary of love now felt more like a painful reminder of everything we had lost. I tried to bridge the widening gap between us by mentioning the times she used to check on me during the day. Samantha gave a sharp response, barely lifting her eyes from her papers, as if to say things change. One evening, after returning home from work, I gathered the courage to approach her. I missed the closeness we once had, and I was desperate to find a way to reconnect. I softly mentioned our first anniversary, recalling the candlelit dinner on the terrace and our dance under the stars. Samantha paused, looked up from her laptop, and her face gave nothing away. "What's the point of this?" she asked. I sighed, confessing, I miss us. I miss how things used to be." She let out an audible sigh, closed her laptop with a finality I couldn't ignore, and told me that now wasn't the time. She was swamped with work and didn't have the luxury of sitting around reminiscing. I felt a sharp pang of rejection, and I voiced my desire to spend time together like we used to. Samantha's expression hardened, and she mentioned how times had changed, highlighting her responsibilities while I was still figuring things out. She told me she didn't have time for sweet talk and suggested that we could talk when she wasn't overwhelmed with work. I nodded quietly, feeling the weight of the growing distance between us. "Okay, Samantha, whenever you're ready." As I walked away, the silence in our home seemed colder and more pronounced than ever. While walking through the park with my dog, I felt a spark of optimism growing inside me. Despite the failure of my business, I reminded myself it was just one setback in the bigger picture of life. I whispered to my dog, patting him on the head, "It's just another challenge. I can and will rise again." When I returned home, I found Samantha at the dressing table, applying her lipstick and makeup with effortless grace. Her reflection caught my eye, and for a moment, I was transported back to the early days of our love. I walked over with a soft smile and complimented her beauty. Samantha didn't even acknowledge me. She kept focusing on her reflection, finishing up her makeup. When she was done, she looked at herself in the mirror and smiled, saying with a sense of certainty, "I am beautiful." In an attempt to reconnect with Samantha, I casually asked about her work schedule for the evening. She paused, eyeing me with some curiosity before responding, "Around 7, I think." "Why?" she asked, clearly intrigued. With a playful wink, I replied, "Oh, no particular reason, just curious." But inside, I was already planning a small surprise for her. Tonight, I would cook her favorite dinner, complete with the bottle of wine she loved. It wasn't much, but I hoped it could be the first step in healing the rift between us, a way to bring her attention back to what we had. After all, restoring our bond might just be the motivation I needed to breathe new life into my failing business. I had to ask myself, was this a step in the right direction? The day passed as I worked to refresh our home. Upbeat music played softly in the background, filling the air with a sense of warmth. Every dish washed, every surface cleaned, brought me a small sense of pride. I wanted the house to feel like a welcoming space when Samantha came home. After a final sweep through the house, I headed out to the grocery store to gather the ingredients for our dinner. On a whim, I also decided to stop by the wine store for her favorite bottle. When I entered, the familiar sound of the door chime echoed through the shop. Pam, the saleswoman, spotted me right away and greeted me with a smile. "It's been a while. How've you been?" she asked warmly. I offered a half smile, responding, "Better days but getting by." "Looking for something special?" Pam asked, raising her eyebrows. I gave a casual chuckle and said, "Something like that." As I mentioned, Samantha had already been there about an hour ago to pick up a bottle of the same wine. Pam seemed to realize she might have shared a bit too much. She paused, her face flushing slightly, then hurriedly wrapped the bottle, clearing her throat as she tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. On my drive home, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Had Samantha been planning something for me too? But why would she have bought the wine earlier in the day? I gripped the steering wheel, torn between hope and doubt. One thing was certain: I would soon find out. I took a deep breath as I pulled into the driveway and steadied myself for the evening ahead. The meal filled the house with a tantalizing aroma, but it didn't fully quiet the storm in my mind. I glanced at the clock. 7:45 p.m. Samantha was usually punctual. Maybe her work was running late? I tried to reassure myself, but the unease remained. Sitting at the dining table, set for two, I occasionally checked my phone, hoping for a call or a message. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock. Each minute that passed deepened the mystery of Samantha's absence. By 8:30 p.m., my phone finally rang, and I recognized Samantha's ringtone. I answered quickly. "Hey! Hey, babe!" Samantha's voice came through, rushed and breathless. "Where are you?" I kept my tone light, masking my worry. "I've been waiting for you. What's going on?" "I'm so sorry, Paul," she responded, sounding flustered. "An unexpected business trip came up, and I couldn't turn it down. My boss insisted." I tried to process the news. "Oh, okay. But can't you leave in the morning or something?" "I'm already on my way there," she sighed. "It's a big opportunity. Could open some doors for me." I breathed deeply, forcing myself to be understanding. "I get it, but I wish you had told me sooner." I know," she said, the stress evident in her voice. "Everything happened so fast. I really have to go, Paul." I looked at the table I had carefully set, the dinner I had prepared, and felt a pang in my chest. "All right, take care, Samantha. Call me when you can." "I will. I'll be back soon. Bye. And just so you know, I don't know how long this will last. Maybe 2 weeks." As the call ended, I sank into the chair, my shoulders heavy with the weight of the evening's events. The sudden trip seemed plausible, but the earlier purchase of the wine still nagged at me. Perhaps it was nothing, just a coincidence, or maybe she just wanted something familiar for her trip. I tried to rationalize, but doubts clouded my thoughts. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to focus. There was a meal in front of me, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. I served myself a plate and moved to the living room, where the soft glow of the TV flickered on. The sound of a game playing in the background provided a temporary escape. Sometimes, a distraction was just what I needed to regain some clarity. I sank deeper into the couch, letting the excitement of the game wash over me. Every now and then, a chuckle escaped, genuine amusement escaping my lips. When my glass was empty, I stood and made my way to the kitchen for a refill. Slowly, the weight of the evening's anxieties began to fade, replaced by a lighter, more relaxed feeling. As I walked past the study, something unusual caught my attention. A flicker of light from the computer screen. It was a subtle glow, the kind that only appeared when notifications were received or if the computer was disturbed. My curiosity got the best of me, and I stepped into the study, flipping on the overhead light. I half-joked to myself that maybe someone had left it on after a few too many drinks. But just as I was about to leave, I heard another noise from the computer. A small pop-up appeared in the corner of the screen, announcing, "Photos successfully synced." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued, and approached the desk. Clicking on the notification, I watched the screen load for a moment before revealing a list of files, each with a timestamp from just hours ago. Hesitant but driven by a growing need to know, I opened one of the files. The image slowly materialized, starting from the top and moving down. My heart sank as it became clear. Samantha's smiling face appeared, surrounded by a setting that was all too familiar. As the photo loaded fully, the truth hit me like a punch to the stomach. There she was, my wife, playfully taking a selfie while sitting on her boss's lap. My body felt heavy, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I slumped into the chair beside me, my head sinking into my hands. All the doubts I had buried deep inside rushed back, confirmed now by the image in front of me. The playful glint in Samantha's eyes, the way she leaned into her boss. It painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The wine-eyed had earlier churned uncomfortably in my stomach. I couldn't stop myself from clicking on another file. A new sequence of photos appeared. This time, Samantha and her boss were at a fancy bar. In some pictures, they were laughing and toasting their glasses. In others, they were engrossed in conversation, their faces too close for comfort. With each photo, the reality of what had been happening became undeniable. The dinner I'd so carefully prepared, the effort to rekindle what we once had, it all seemed like cruel irony now. I felt a rush of anger, pain, and betrayal, but mostly, an overwhelming sense of loss. I stood up and walked away from the computer, no longer interested in the glass of wine I still held. I needed something stronger, something to numb the crushing weight of the truth. With a light drizzle falling outside, I grabbed my coat and stepped into the night. My thoughts were in chaos as I made my way to the liquor store. Each step felt heavier, as if the pain of what I just discovered was breaking me into pieces. Memories of the happier times with Samantha flashed in my mind, but now they were overshadowed by this new reality. Why? The question haunted me, echoing through my mind. Why had Samantha pulled away? Had I failed her somehow? I thought back to the times when my business was doing well, when we had big plans and dreams. I remembered promising Samantha the latest Mercedes, a symbol of success and luxury, but I never followed through on that promise. Maybe that broken promise was part of the reason she had drifted away, or maybe there was more to it. Small moments, unspoken words that built up over time. But one thing was for sure. Our relationship had changed, and I was left with an aching emptiness and confusion. As I entered the liquor store, the rainwater dripping off my face, Pam immediately noticed the change in my demeanor. She greeted me with a concerned look, clearly sensing something was wrong. "Hey, Paul," she said gently. "Tough day." I could barely whisper as I spoke. "Whiskey, please." Pam, perceptive as always, paused and gave me a soft, knowing look. "You sure about that? If you want to talk," she trailed off, but I cut her off with a shake of my head. "Just the whiskey, thanks," I muttered. She didn't push any further, just handed me the bottle. I gave her a weak, weary smile before leaving the store. I didn't wait until I was home to crack open the whiskey. The burn of the alcohol hit my throat, but it didn't do much to ease the pain. As I stumbled down the street, the drink seemed to amplify my emotions. I found myself shouting at strangers passing by, barely aware of what I was saying. "Hey!" I slurred, pointing aimlessly. "You know my wife? She's off somewhere having a blast with her boss. And here I am, having a solo party." I laughed bitterly, the words dripping with sarcasm. "Yep, just me. One-man celebration." I became increasingly disoriented as time passed. My speech, already slurred from the alcohol, grew more incoherent. I began to sing bits of a song that had played earlier in my home, the very same one that had been meant to accompany a romantic dinner for two. My voice faltered, sometimes staying on key, other times drifting completely off tune. The sadness in my rendition was unmistakable, and the melody felt as broken as my heart. Stumbling along the sidewalk, I realized with a jolt that I had somehow lost my whiskey bottle. I assumed I'd finished it, but the thought of another drink drove me to head back to the store. As I swayed and muttered to myself, I dug into my pockets for money, but found nothing. That's when I noticed an older man nearby, eyeing me with a mix of concern and curiosity. I raised my voice, slurring my words as I asked if he had something to say. The old man, dressed in glasses and carrying a worn backpack, looked startled by my sudden aggression. But before he could respond, my tone shifted from confrontation to desperation. I apologized to him, my voice trembling as I explained how badly I needed another drink. I even asked if he could spare $120. The elderly man sighed and rummaged through his pockets, pulling out a few crumpled bills. He handed them to me, telling me it was all he had. I muttered a thank you, still steady on my feet, and then, on impulse, suggested he join me for a drink. He gently declined, his concern obvious as he noted that I had already had enough. I was about to argue, but my stomach lurched, and I vomited onto the pavement. The mist in the air made everything damp, and a chill began to seep into my bones. I leaned against a brick wall, my eyes squeezed shut, trying to catch my breath. The old man, watching me with furrowed brows, gently asked if I lived nearby. In my muddled state, I could only murmur that I wanted to sleep, gazing at the nearly empty street, the dim light from a nearby lamp post casting long shadows across the wet pavement. The old man, concerned, advised that it wasn't the right place to sleep, especially in such weather. With a quiet grunt, he helped me to my feet, taking most of my weight. Encouraging me, he led me toward a nearby bridge. Beneath the bridge, hidden from the rain and prying eyes, was a small makeshift shelter that the old man called home. It was crafted from discarded materials and tarps, offering only a bit of shelter, but it was dry and relatively warm. I woke to the soft chirping of morning birds. My surroundings were unfamiliar, and my vision was clouded in a fog, likely from the excesses of the previous night. My skull throbbed painfully as I tried to understand where I was. A soft, muted light revealed a simple wooden shelter. With a groan, I pushed the curtain aside and stepped out, trying to get my bearings. By a gently flowing river, the elderly man sat calmly, casting a fishing line. His posture was relaxed, hands steady despite the marks of time that covered his skin. As I approached cautiously, he greeted me with a warm, knowing smile, mentioning that it had taken me a while to wake up and that we'd had too much fun the night before. I blinked in confusion, my mind still trying to catch up. Stammering, I explained that I couldn't remember how I ended up here. The man, David Hughes, chuckled softly and explained that I had drunk too much the night before and passed out on the pavement. Concerned about leaving me there, he had taken me to his shelter. My face flushed with embarrassment, and I thanked David, hoping I hadn't caused any trouble. David leaned back, the sunlight reflecting off his wrinkled eyes. With a slight smile, he admitted that I had been a bit loud, especially when shouting about my wife. Guilt washed over me, and I apologized, explaining that I had been going through a rough patch. David's expression softened, and he shared some wisdom, revealing that he, too, had experienced loss and grief. Pain, he said, has its own way of healing, and time is the greatest aid. David suggested we have breakfast. Without thinking, I asked for something to drink to help ease my splitting headache. David chuckled, as if he had expected this, and soon, the comforting aroma of simmering fish soup filled the air. I watched as David skillfully prepared the meal, and I couldn't help but comment on how heavenly it smelled. David gave a wink, attributing the recipe to an old family tradition, perfect for mornings like this one. As we sat together, savoring the warmth and depth of the fish soup under the open sky, David paused, offering me a piece of advice. I sighed, acknowledging the need to avoid letting alcohol take control of one's life. David's gaze lingered for a moment, and then he shared his perspective. Life, he said, was complicated, and sometimes it was better to let go and move on, especially when someone had wronged you. I detected a hint of sadness in his eyes, but I didn't push him to elaborate. Instead, I thanked him for everything, explaining that I needed to head home. While getting ready to leave, something caught my attention. Intricately carved wooden figures and trinkets scattered outside the shack. Impressed, I asked if David had made them. His eyes brightened as he nodded, telling me they were part of his past, pieces he still held on to. Woodworking, he explained, brought him peace. I complimented him on his skill, genuinely admiring the work. As I walked away, a smile tugged at my lips. For the first time in a while, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Back home, I rushed straight to my computer, determined to reach out to local furniture stores in the coming days. My ideas were bubbling over with excitement, and I was eager to pitch them. 1 week later, brimming with newfound enthusiasm, I retraced my steps to David's riverside shack. But when I arrived, the place seemed eerily empty. David's backpack and jacket lay nearby, as though he had just stepped out. Confusion gnawed at me. Where could David be? I scanned the area, but he was nowhere in sight. Maybe he's out fishing, I thought, or gathering wood. I figured I'd come back the next day. Just as I began my walk back, an irritating little stone found its way into my shoe. Each step became more uncomfortable, like an itch I couldn't reach. With a frustrated sigh, I stopped to remove the stone. As I lifted my shoe, my gaze wandered beyond it, and my heart skipped a beat. There, in the distance, stood a lone figure dangerously close to the edge of the bridge. The scene was hauntingly familiar, and panic instantly gripped me. Without a second thought, I shoved my foot back into my shoe, not even bothering to tie the laces. I shouted, desperation thick in my voice, urging the person on the edge to move back. With each step, I prayed I would reach them in time, hoping they could hear me. The wooden planks of the bridge groaned beneath my feet as I hurried forward, and soon David's form came into view. Relief flooded me momentarily, but it evaporated when I noticed the coil of rope on the ground beside him. A pit of dread opened in my stomach, replacing any sense of comfort. His eyes met mine, filled with sorrow, and the despair in them spoke volumes. Without thinking twice, I approached slowly, making sure not to startle him. Gently, I placed an arm around his shoulders. We stood there for a long moment, two broken souls sharing a silent, vulnerable connection. I could feel David's body tremble as he fought to hold back his tears. I pulled him into a tight embrace, grounding him in that moment, both of us bound by the weight of our emotions. "It's okay," I whispered softly into his ear, my voice steady despite the overwhelming emotions that surged within me. "I'm here. We'll face this together." Sitting side by side on the bridge, David began to unravel his story, his voice carrying the heaviness of years lived in pain and loss. He spoke of his service to the country and his job at a food processing plant. It wasn't glamorous, he said, but it was honest work. His voice softened, a weariness creeping into his tone, as he described how he had tried his best to provide for his daughter, who meant everything to him. As David rubbed his forehead, I could sense the weight of his memories pressing down on him. He explained how, after the plant downsized, he lost his job and missed a rent payment. The following week, he was evicted. He told me how it felt like every door was closing, and how he found himself with nothing, no safety net to catch him. His eyes clouded with pain as he spoke of returning to his hometown, hoping for better luck, but facing rejection wherever he turned. Without a permanent address, he couldn't get a job. He described being picked up for sleeping in places he shouldn't, falling ill and struggling to get by. Eventually, he found a brief respite in a friend's van, but it was only temporary. Then, he stumbled upon the shack by the bridge, which had become his home. He exhaled deeply, his breath heavy with the weight of the pain he had carried for so long. "The hardest part," David said, his voice trembling slightly, "was knowing that my daughter was out there thinking I had abandoned her. His eyes clouded with the shadows of the past, but his voice grew softer as he continued, recounting how he'd felt utterly lost, trapped in a cycle of hopelessness. He had reached the bridge in his darkest moment, contemplating an end he felt was inevitable. As I listened, my heart opened to David in a way I hadn't expected. This man, whose life had been worn down by hardship, still had a spark of humanity that called out to me, stirring a deep sense of protectiveness. My hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in a kind of silent vow to stand by him. We made our way back to the shack, and I spoke to him with the kind of warmth that comes from true empathy. "You've had more than your fair share of life's punches, David," I said, trying to offer some comfort. "But you're not in this alone anymore. We'll get through this together." David looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if the words I'd spoken were too good to be true. He was silent for a moment, and then something shifted in his gaze. Hope flickered, just a glimmer, but it was enough. I saw that spark, and it gave me an idea. "David," I began, carefully choosing my words, "I've been thinking. You and I could do something together, start a small furniture business. You've got the talent and I have the vision. We could craft something special, maybe even begin with cradles." At first, David stared at me, taken aback by the suggestion, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to be a part of such a thing. But then, slowly, a small, tentative light began to shine in his eyes. "You think you can trust me with that?" he asked, his voice cautious but hopeful. "I wouldn't have suggested it if I didn't," I said firmly, nodding my assurance. For the next 2 weeks, the sound of saws and hammers filled the garage at my house as David and I worked side by side, crafting cradles. The rhythm of the work, the simplicity of our shared goal, brought a sense of calm and purpose to our lives. We laughed together, swapped stories, and in those moments, David began to seem less like a man broken by life and more like someone starting to build something again. When the cradles were finished, I loaded them up and took them to the local furniture stores. It didn't take long for the store owners to recognize the craftsmanship in each piece. The delicate details, the smooth finish, the care that went into every curve. These were not just cradles, they were works of art. One store owner, intrigued, asked where they had come from, and I proudly told them about David. "My friend David crafted these. He's a true artist," I said. Soon, orders began to flood in. Word spread, and our little venture became a small but successful business. The cradles were in demand, and I could see the transformation happening right before my eyes. Not just in the cradles, but in David, in me, in the life we were building together. But even as our success grew, there were still shadows of the past. One day, my phone rang with Samantha's name flashing on the screen. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, the weight of the past always lingering just beneath the surface. I picked up, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the tension in her voice. "Hey, Ethan," Samantha said, her tone hurried. "I'm still abroad, and there's been a delay. I need to borrow some money." I froze, a wave of frustration and sadness crashing over me. "Samantha, I'm sorry, but I can't help you with that right now," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out before she finally responded, her voice sharp with irritation. "Fine. Forget it," she snapped, and before I could say anything else, she hung up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand, the knot in my stomach tightening. But then I shook it off. David and I were building something here, something real, and nothing was going to take that from me. Our business continued to grow, and soon we outgrew the garage. I remembered Chris mentioning an old barn outside of town that was just sitting unused. It was perfect for what we needed, so we made the move. The barn was huge, and soon we hired a few local workers, eager to learn the craft and be part of something meaningful. One evening, after a long day at the barn, I returned home to a surprise. David and I usually shared a simple dinner with the crew, but that night I had something special planned. When David walked through the door, his eyes widened as he took in the sight of the neatly set table, the savory smells wafting from the kitchen. He stood there, momentarily confused. I smiled and gestured toward the table. "Please sit down, David." Dinner will be ready soon. David hesitated, then sat down at the table, his curiosity evident in his eyes. I could feel the excitement building in me, knowing what was about to happen. I joined him at the table, my heart racing as I removed my apron, a grin spreading across my face. "I hope you're not upset," I said, my voice filled with an emotion I could hardly describe. Before David could respond, the doorbell rang, and I quickly went to answer it. When I opened the door, a young girl walked in. She was shy, her eyes wide as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. A woman followed her in, and I saw David's face change in an instant, his features shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then to joy. It was his daughter, Lily. He stood, stumbling toward her, and in a rush, they embraced. All the emotion he had buried for so long finally came to the surface, tears flowing freely as he held her close. Behind them, I stood with Rachel, watching the reunion with a warm smile. It was a moment of healing, of renewal, of everything we had worked for coming full circle. Lily's voice wavered as she spoke through tears, her words heavy with emotion. "I thought I'd never see you again, Dad." David's voice cracked as he replied, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have reached out." Lily, her tone soft and understanding, said, "You should have, Dad, but it's okay now." As she gently stroked his hair, David nodded, holding on to her as if afraid she would disappear if he let go. His gaze shifted between Rachel and Lily, a hint of confusion in his eyes. Lily laughed softly and explained, "That's Rachel." David looked at his granddaughter, the little girl who had once been a tiny infant in photos, now a living, breathing presence before him. I gently clapped my hands to capture their attention. "Well, everyone, dinner is ready. Please come to the table," I announced. As they gathered around the table, Lily opened up about her struggles over the past month. She shared how her relentless search for her father had put a strain on her marriage, eventually leading to their separation. It had been an emotional roller coaster, but at that moment, with her father by her side and new friends around her, Lily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The warmth in my home grew with Lily and Rachel's presence. Their laughter filled the space, adding an energy that felt healing. I invited them to stay, knowing it would help David rebuild the bond with his daughter that had been lost for so long. One evening, while I was buried in paperwork in my home office, the sound of the main door creaking open caught my attention. It wasn't David or Lily. Those two always announced their return with cheer. Looking up, I saw Samantha standing in the doorway. She looked worn out, her shoulders slumped and dark circles under her eyes. She sighed, dropped her bags, and stretched. "That trip was quite an experience," she murmured. I watched her quietly, a deep furrow forming on my brow. She walked past me, her exhaustion evident, and collapsed onto the living room sofa. I took a slow breath, then stood up and approached her. I hesitated for a moment before sitting beside her, leaving some space between us. "Look, Paul, I know things have been complicated," Samantha began, her voice heavy with fatigue. I raised a hand, cutting her off. "Did you have your phone sync turned off?" I asked quietly, my tone controlled. She looked confused for a moment, but then her eyes widened in realization. My stomach tightened, and I swallowed hard, fighting back the emotions that threatened to spill over. "I saw the pictures, Samantha. I didn't need to see more than a few to understand." Her eyes filled with panic as she moved closer to me. "Paul, please listen. It's not how it seems. We were just—" I stood up suddenly, cutting her off. "I wish I hadn't seen those photos, Samantha, but now that I have, things can't go back to how they were. I can't, and I won't, pretend everything's okay." Her voice trembled as she begged, "Paul, just give me a chance to explain." I shook my head. "I think it's best if you leave." Samantha's tone grew desperate, frustration seeping through. "So this is it? You won't even hear me out? Fine, leave. But just remember, no one will ever stand by you the way I did. No one will love you like I did." Just as the tension between us reached its peak, the sound of the front door creaking open interrupted the standoff. David had just entered and froze at the sight of the scene. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he silently retreated, closing the door behind him to give us privacy. Samantha's posture shifted as her attempts to regain control faltered. She appeared genuinely remorseful, her voice softening. "Paul, I'm truly sorry," she whispered. While I acknowledged her apology, my voice remained firm. I told her it was time for her to leave. As Samantha exited, I saw Rachel outside on the lawn, playing happily. She spotted me and came running, throwing her arms around my legs in a tight hug. The innocent embrace felt like a stark contrast to the heaviness of the moment, a symbol of what had been lost and what might still be possible in the future. Samantha lingered in the background, watching the scene unfold. A sharp realization seemed to hit her. Perhaps someone else could offer me the love and respect I deserved, something she had failed to give.